Is a Friday afternoon again. It's about 4 o'clock here. We are about a minute early for a change. That's great. Um, I was reading recently where I normally read, which is in Proverbs, way back when, in I think 1973. I was challenged by an outstanding teacher to read a chapter of Proverbs a day. And he said in his teaching, uh, if nothing else, it will provoke you to ask for wisdom. And I did that. And I really believe that over time, reading Proverbs and praying that God will give wisdom bears real fruit. And I'm very pleased with the fact that someone said that to me early on. So I'm saying it to you. But I was reading in Proverbs 11. And verse 11 in the New Living Translation says, upright citizens are good for a city and make it prosper. But the talk of the wicked tears it apart. You know, I just really believe that. I've watched it. I've actually lived in and around London for over half a century. And London is well known as the world's foremost commodities trading platform and one of the larger listings of shares of any city. And, and yet it's changed so much. I remember talking to a man, he became a close friend and was part of an accountability group that Marty and I would meet with regularly. And he said, you know, when I first started in this business, and he developed properties, he developed especially historically significant properties. He said huge deals would be talked through and then sealed with a handshake. Now, underlying that handshake would have been a contract or contracts that were given as standard contracts for that sector of the economy, and everybody working in that sector would have generally agreed with those. And if they had any disagreement with it, they would make changes. But if they were working with this standard contract, a handshake, and it was done. Uh, that dear man, who was such a friend for a couple of decades, um, had to go back to work in his 70s because all of his savings, which were really substantial, have been wiped out through deceitful dealings in the city of London. And that sequence signaled a change like a sea change, a tidal change in the city of London. And lawyers began to be the most valuable asset in the city because contracts had to be more and more and more very, very detailed, like big contracts running to over 1,000 pages. Why? Well, because of the loss of trust. So upright citizens are good for a city and make it prosper, but the talk of the wicked tears it apart. Now, I want to talk about that. You know, I grew up in a high trust environment. I grew up in a small town, 30,000, um, and and we had a very small police force, and there was very little crime. I remember very distinctly the first time in my lifetime, as far as I knew, there was a murder in our town, and it was just so shocking. But that was a harbinger of things to come. Murders and gun deaths in that town wouldn't be that unusual now. Now there were gun deaths because still, when someone was suicidal, that's the method they most often chose. And I've only registered recently that the extraordinarily high gun death um, statistics in the U.S. Uh, include self-inflicted gun deaths, and in fact, that's about 2/3 of them. So that's really high, um, and that we don't want to conflate when we're talking about these things. that figure with the actual murder rate. Both are unacceptably high. And that, too, is a sign of societal disintegration. That which was integrated is now disintegrated. What is that about? Well, just kind of cogitating on that, I thought that reminded me of a book and a man who became a friend. I haven't had much contact with him recently, but a wonderful man named Dr. Michael Schluter, who did a lot of research work and academics at Cambridge University. And he wrote a book called The R Factor. And you could summarize it by saying that high trust societies, cultures, are efficient. And low trust societies or cultures are inefficient. And he did quite a lot of work to make that point really clear. And ever since I heard him, and we went on a couple of trips to conferences together, and I remember driving him in my car, or maybe it was the other way around, and I was talking about this fact as we drove along, and I thought, that makes so much sense. And since then, my life experience has just confirmed that. Now, I don't know if this is interesting to you, if you've been watching so far. I may have lost quite a few viewers, but I think this is really important to us right now. And it's important to the question of whether or not we are, in these Western countries, shaped by biblical Christianity historically. Not that everybody was Christian, but the values of our societies. Thou shalt not steal, even if you're poor. You don't lie. You don't bear false witness to people. These things were given as our society values. And to me, it illustrates something that I think many people have spoken about recently. I just looked at a part of a video today from an Australian journalist and an ex-politician interviewing him, John Anderson. And he was saying, no, we still are guided by Christian values. I think, yes, we are. But there are many dissenting voices now, and there didn't used to be any. Not that everybody would have agreed with the rightness and the reliability of the Christian faith, but they would have accepted the values and realized that you couldn't resist those values or violate those values without unacceptable consequences. So, what does that mean? Well, it means this, that ever since first secular humanism and then Islam began to comprise significant percentages of our population, we now have, generally speaking, 3 different sets of beliefs that guide us. One is biblical Christianity. We're familiar with that. The 10 Commandments used to be posted in most schools or many schools. The Pledge of Allegiance in the U.S. was always stated. There were prayers in assemblies, in Christian assemblies in most schools in England, still are in many. So the values we're familiar with. And we were expected to generally adhere to those values in all of our education and all of our work life. And then along came the growth of secular humanism that really didn't gain much traction until after the Second World War. And that has with it the idea that we, human beings, top of the evolutionary pile, we decide morality. So we only believe in ourselves, and that's why there are strong humanist voices who promote abortion right up to full term, which is where we are here in the UK right now. The legislative battle is on. And I think many people think that Parliament will pass a law allowing abortion for any reason, practically right up to full term. Of course, that means, what about immediate after term, after birth? Difficult. And at the same time, we have new legislation going through to promote assisted suicide. And there was an article and a commentary in one of the newspapers yesterday, or maybe it was the BBC Online, but one way or another, it was an article which just unashamedly said, we've got too many old people. They are a drag on our economy. The younger people really can't support all these older people. So we need to say to them, we can make the ending of your life easy. Let us help you. And some of the countries that have adopted that kind of legislation have also discovered that after maybe 5 to 10 years, a high percentage of the elderly population feel guilty about being alive and feel pressure to end their lives. We don't want to live in a society like that, because a society that respects its older people and protects its most vulnerable is one that thrives. It's part of the kingdom of God. So our beliefs give rise to our values, and our values determine our behavior. That's just the way we are. That's the way we're wired as human beings. So then later along comes an influx of Muslim immigration. And I've spent a lot of time in Muslim nations, and I have some lovely Muslim friends and people I really respect and people I've met. And let me just tell you one little story, because I want you to know this is not a general discriminatory talk I'm giving. I'm just trying to illustrate that different beliefs give rise to different values, which give rise to different behavior. And when the behavior is at odds with people of other behavior, then that society becomes less and less viable. And I'll come back to address that and illustrate it before we close. Thankfully, now we have quite a lot of time. So I felt strongly led by God to do the reconciliation walk. And so over the period of the 900th anniversary of the First Crusade took 3.5 years from leaving from Cologne, Germany, to get to Jerusalem, and then capturing Jerusalem, conquering it, killing all inhabitants. Over that period, 900 years ago, horrific injustices and cruelty were inflicted on Orthodox, Muslim, and Jewish populations all along the route from Cologne in Germany through to Jerusalem. I don't know what the distance of that is, about 3,500 kilometers. So we walked. Nobody walked more than from Cologne to Istanbul. But then we sort of took it in relays, and 2,500 people participated. It was astonishing how that worked out. And when I first felt I should do that, and I knew that it was a command thing. God just wanted this done. I drew out on maps where we might go. I looked at the routes of the First Crusades. I thought we need to follow that more or less. But I'm not going to take young people or any people. I'm not going to encourage them to walk, as we did. We walked through all these areas. I'm not going to encourage them to walk through southern Lebanon because it's Hezbollah country, and it's been very unstable, and there have been a lot of kidnappings of Western journalists and other Western people of significance, and held for ransom and dragged on for years and years. And people really suffered. I thought, I'm not going to walk through that part. So in my little booklet that I wrote and developed and published for that, the map of our route goes around Lebanon. It goes up through Syria and Jordan and back in. But that was not the route of the First Crusade. However, by the time we got there in 1999, I thought, no, we will walk. And I and a friend of mine walked that bit. A few others did a little. But we walked through southern Lebanon. And to my astonishment, the friendliest people of the whole journey were there in the area around Tyre and Sidon. And the hospitality was just, it was over the top. And the smiles. I don't have the picture with me. I'm not sure I can find it again, but I have a picture of one of the most friendly faces you'll ever see. It was a young guy, and I would have thought a young man in Hezbollah country would be really dangerous. But he had such a big welcome. Welcomed us into his shop and fed us and gave us drinks and asked if he could help us. And it was just such a warm experience. But more than that, we had many meals with Muslim friends. We had friends who became close, especially over that period, who visited us here in the UK. We visited them. Our eldest son stayed with a wonderful elderly Muslim family in Beirut. Lived on the top floor of their farmhouse. It was right in the middle of Beirut in the high-rise apartments. They had kept that little farmhouse, and he stayed on the top floor of that with his chickens for a year and loved it because the couple were just so kind. So I don't have a prejudice against individual Muslims, but I do know that beliefs have consequences. Beliefs guide our values, and our values guide our behavior and our language, our conversation. And there are differences between biblical Christianity, secular humanism, and Islam. Now, I need to say something a little bit more about the Islam side. There has been a battle going on in the Muslim parts of the world since about the 1930s, when the Muslim Brotherhood started, and it was a revival of original Islam according to the Brotherhood and according to the fundamentalists, that is, going back to the fundamentals of their faith. And that teaching, which actually came out of a Muslim man held in a British prison in Cairo, that teaching began to gradually flavor more and more of Islam, and there has been it's a battle in places. It's a physical battle in places, and in other places it's a tussle, a debate, and oftentimes a heated debate and power plays going on to see who rules that given part of the Muslim world. And I found it really interesting recently to find that some of the senior politicians from our country, from England, had traveled down to the Arab Emirates for a conference. And one of the things that was reported in the newspapers was how the rulers of the Emirates and the surrounding Muslim nations have actually stamped out pretty much the activities of the Muslim fundamentalists, and they're dismayed to seeing the fundamentalists grow in power and number in Europe, because they tend to then go back and also try to take back that territory. So what you have in that situation is actually two sets of beliefs in one religion. Now we have that in Christianity too, but the values turn out much the same, whereas the so-called moderate Muslims, whom the fundamentalists would say are not Muslims at all, the moderate Muslims have gradually, I think, absorbed more and more of the values of the free market democratic nations of the West, but they implement those via their rulers, who are the final word. They're not the only place where that's true. It's also true in Singapore. It has been true in other parts of the world where I think of Rwanda now, where a benign dictator actually does a lot of good to the general quality of life in the nation, as long as you're obedient. And if you step out of line, then it goes hard for you. And that's often the only route from the chaos that the revolutionaries would like through back to a stable society. So we now have in England, Canada certainly, Australia yes, the US absolutely, and generally in France and Sweden and European nations in general, Germany growingly, we have a sector of society which, from my perspective, how I understand it from talking with many Muslims and talking with Christians from Muslim nations and all, is that whereas there are so many wonderful people and hospitality is great and the smiles are genuine, nevertheless there is under the surface this jockeying for who has the final power. Islam is a power-based religion. Christianity is not meant to be, although it's been turned into that by politicians and by the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches at times in history. So whenever Christian leaders are using force or coercion, they are at odds with the foundational literature of biblical Christianity. And we know that. Whereas the difference here with Islam is that the argument goes on, and the fundamentalists would say, we are the ones who are being true to our fundamental literature, the stories of, well, the Quran and the stories of Hadith and the traditions of the scholars down through the centuries. That's an argument that we can't really contribute to. We have to listen and watch from afar and hope that the more moderate approach, which has the possibility of living at peace in Christian environments, we've got to hope that wins out, that argument. But in many ways, the more destructive belief system and values to our societies in the West have come from the secular humanists. Because if you believe that we are the apex of the evolutionary process, so we are all there is, and it lies within our power to set the values of our societies. And if you believe, especially this, if you believe that morality evolves and ethics, so moralities are deeply held beliefs about what has good and bad attached to it. Our ethics is how we work that out, how we manifest it. So if our ethics and our morality are evolving, then that means they can be influenced to evolve in a particular direction. And I'm grateful to Phil Manginelli and the work that he's done, as have many others, to look at the history of Western world attitudes towards, say, especially same-sex sexual activities, which were taboo all through the 60s, 70s, and frowned upon in the later 70s, and then all through the 80s, and finally a group of same-sex attracted people with quite a lot of wealth and some real skills in public relations got together and developed a plan. And the plan was to make the values of these Western nations evolve towards fully accepting, even celebrating, same-sex relationships. That was in 1989. They wrote a book called After the Ball, and the book maps out exactly what happened. The only difference between the map they did then and what's happened is it happened faster than they thought it would. And what did they do? Well, they influenced, especially the entertainment media and sports to some extent, but especially films and plays and TV programs, and then just general influence on government and on politicians, and it was just a really good strategy with a lot of money put behind it. And in the space of less than a decade, the changes in our attitudes towards that were dramatic. And then the number of people expressing same-sex attraction grew and grew and grew, and it's been doubling for the last few years. Now, you may say, as homosexual people have been saying for a long time, no, that's genetic. But that's never been established. There's no gay gene. That's getting into an area in which I have no expertise, but I read and I realize that no authority anywhere said, well, yes, it is. It's in our DNA. No, it's not. So many different reasons for it, apparently. But the fact is that when you promote it consistently through the education system, through entertainment, and through fashion and all kinds of other influential parts of our society, the arts, then gradually you get a really positive attitude towards it, and people begin experimenting. And early age same-sex relationships is definitely one of the ways that people end up with same-sex attraction. Now, many people are going to be upset at all this, but these are just facts. These are just, well established. I'm not giving you all the research behind it because that's not my style, but I read widely enough to know these are the facts. Now, the result of that has been on the general interaction between people is we have a clash of at least three major sets of values. And whenever we have those, we have violent conversation that often leads to physical and sometimes deadly violence. I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'm just saying that's the way it is. That's the way it's happened. The result of that is loss of trust. And the loss of trust means that our world becomes more and more and more bureaucratic. The thing that, the combination of factors that got these thoughts going again in my head, these come up from time to time, is that proverb. And then combined with the fact that my wife, Marty, has been doing the paperwork of a property transaction we're involved with, where we just had an apartment for a little while, rented out, and we're selling it. And oh my goodness, the paperwork. She has been under more stress than I have seen her, I think, ever, except maybe with 3 little boys, and hypothyroxia. But she's been under such stress. Why? Because there was just no trust. And so the contracts involved in selling a property or doing any kind of significant business deal are just so complex. And they want so much information that the average person doesn't keep, but it's somewhere. When the last lot of sale contracts were signed, but there are a lot more of them now. And how about you? You if you're not selling a property, you engage with some sort of transactions. Do you ever get frustrated by the number of security measures you have to go through before you get into a particular online site, or before you get to use your bank account or your credit card? How many times do you have to go through 2-tier or 3-tier security? And how about airports? We now have to go 3 hours ahead of time because security can be slow, because there's so much of it. Why? Why is this? Well, we don't trust each other. Why don't we trust each other? Because we have foundational differences in our beliefs. Can we ever trust again? Well, I listened to somebody today who said, yes, I think we can. If I had to guess at this point, I'd say, no, we'll probably go through more fractures in society and deeper divisions until it becomes really, really obvious about what sets of beliefs work and are efficient, effective, make it possible for people to make good livings and keep jobs and not be canceled and all the rest. We may have to have even more dramatic evidence that the secular humanist views don't work when you put it into government, and that Islam has not produced democratic societies with free and open markets. It just doesn't. It has been imported into a few Muslim nations, but is not fully flourishing. Do people want that? Of course they want that. We want it. We want to be able to not only be free, but influence the way we are governed. And that's what democracy tries to do. At least it gives an opportunity to do. And it has generally produced freedom to say what's on our mind, although that's now being eroded. And it's being eroded here and has been eroded in the U.S. under more liberal governments, where freedom of speech is not so tolerated, because the arguments for their values do fall apart pretty fast. The arguments for long-standing biblical Christian values do hold, except that too many people who would call themselves Christians don't live by the values, which means they don't really hold the beliefs. They've been influenced too much by the other belief systems, and so their values get eroded too. Can we trust again? Well, I've had the privilege of being in a Youth with a Mission team, and then training community, and then larger one and larger one. We welcomed 74 new trainees for this quarter yesterday and the day before, and we started off with, I suppose, 120 or so people in our community. It's a high trust community, you know. People can forget to lock up their valuables, and nothing's going to happen. People leave windows open at night and lights on and doors open and so on, and nothing happens, at least very, very rarely. And that's only when we get someone who is opportunistic from outside. We've had it very rarely. So high trust. You can live really well in that kind of society. Can we live in that again nationwide? Time will tell. And there'll be a lot of changes between now and then. But I have made a point, and I want to reiterate it, that the application of biblical truths of all people created in the image of God and the revealed laws of God, 10 Commandments and so on, are the way to get along with each other. And they produce societies where people can be respected as individuals if they adhere to the values and live that way. That it all comes from biblical truth. And other societies often adopt those things, and that's great. We're really pleased about it. But if biblical Christian beliefs were to be eradicated, I'm not sure that human life on this world would survive. So that will probably create a few comebacks. You can do that on my website, which is just look up lingreen.org or net or whatever, and there I am. And you can make comments on my YouTube channel, or you can make comments on my Facebook channel, but I don't see those very often. I'm better to keep track on the website. If you want to argue, that's fine. I'll answer things. But I'm just talking about fundamental, long-standing Christian beliefs that were all the norm pre, say, 1980. Began to slip in the 60s. But they were the norm. It's the way we lived. And we lived in peaceful, internally, law-abiding societies. We were always in conflict with other belief systems. I'm afraid that can't be avoided on planet Earth until the end of this age and life in the age to come. Feel free to contact me. Thanks very much for watching.